Howdy, this is Browdy. So we are back. This is another video lecture from Unit 2. So far we should have talked about the characteristics of life, excuse me. And from there we started moving on and we just introduced cells with cell theory. Then we moved on to the main types of cells. We talked about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And now we're following this up with organelles. And so if you've been following along, hopefully you have, we should have discussed organelles a little bit already, specifically in the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So hopefully we remember that a prokaryote is different from a eukaryote because it doesn't have a nucleus or organelles. And we talked a little bit about what those were, but today we're really going to go into detail on organelles and what they are. So if you haven't already, go ahead and download the notes and let's get started. So organelles, what are they? The fancy definition, or the definition we'll use to start, are specialized units within a cell that perform specific functions and are enclosed by their own membranes. Now, fancy isn't necessarily the right word, but that is the very specific definition. The way I like to think of it, maybe in almost more general terms, is if you think about how your body, right? So an organism has organs, right? So you have a heart, you have a liver, you have lungs, your skin is an organ, you have all this stuff. Cells have organelles, or little organs. And so what we're looking at here is a picture of a eukaryotic cell, and there's all different kinds of stuff going on. Now we're not going to talk about every single one of these, we are going to talk about some. And so the nucleus is one of the things that we've heard before. That's where DNA is stored and all these different things like that. And so everything you see pictured here is an organelle that serves a specific purpose and helps the cell do some specific function. So the very first thing I want to talk about, and the first four that we'll talk about, are the things that all cells have. So if you're following along with me on the notes, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit. All cells have a cell membrane, cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes. So we'll start there. So the cell membrane. It's the layer that encloses and protects the cell, and it also allows specific things in and out of the cell. It's selectively permeable. Now, selectively permeable means that some things are allowed to permeate or go in and out, and some things are not. And so the membrane isn't just going to let any and everything come in, right? Because if you're in charge of protecting the cell and keeping it separate from the world, if everything can just go in and out willy-nilly, right, that's a problem. We want to keep the cell inside the cell, but sometimes things need to go out, sometimes things need to come in. And it's almost kind of like, it's basically the guard of what goes in and what goes out, or the gatekeepers in a way. Now, the way I like to think of this is if you think about a water balloon, right? There's water on the inside and then there's the balloon itself. The balloon is kind of like the cell membrane because it's what keeps the water balloon from just being a puddle of water on the floor, right? If it were not for the balloon, it would just be a puddle. But we need that balloon to keep the water distinct from the world around it, and the cell membrane does the same thing. Now, if you're following along with me here on the notes, you'll notice that there's a column on the chart for organelles, which talks about which says each organelle's name. There's a function section and a drawing section. The drawing section, that's for you. So if you've printed this out, you can just draw a little picture of what it is, and that's just to help you remember. You do not have to use that, but you can if you want. Sometimes it's very helpful. And so I'm going to focus on the function section specifically. And I'm going to zoom out just a little bit, and I'm going to focus here. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better idea what kind of things to write. So for cell membrane, it encloses and protects the cell, and it's selectively permeable. Oh, sorry, I'll try to do that here. The next thing is the cytoplasm. You might hear this called the cytosol. So if you ever see that, or the cytosol, it's the same as the cytoplasm. And it's a jelly-like fluid that provides structure for the inside of the cell. It also contains the chemical building blocks, so the things that the cell needs to exist and to function properly, those chemicals just kind of exist in the cytoplasm. And so this basically includes everything inside of the cell except the nucleus. And so everything that's floating around is floating in the cytoplasm. So if we use that water balloon analogy again, rather than think of it as water inside, maybe we have like jello. So it's not quite super fluid, but it's still kind of fluid, but it's just not very liquidy, right? It's kind of jelly or gelatinous. And so that's the cytoplasm. It provides structure and it contains the chemical building blocks. DNA. Now, hopefully, DNA is something you've heard of. Maybe not, but more than likely you've heard of DNA in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's on a crime show, a murder mystery. Maybe it's in science class, or maybe you've done the Ancestry.com or 23andMe or something like that. And what DNA is it's a molecule, and specifically it stores information to make proteins. Now, we can go in depth into this picture. Basically, there's just 4 different chemicals that make up DNA. There's 4 different letters. We abbreviate these with the letters that they start with. And all of your DNA is just different orders, different combinations of these letters or these chemicals. And all of those that stretch out real far, real long. I like to think of DNA as it's packaged very small, but there's a ton of it. So if you think of a spindle of thread, that's if you buy thread at the store for like sewing, it comes on a spindle, the little round thing. And it's pretty small in the package, but if you pull off all of the thread little by little, you're going to have a ton of thread, a really long strand of it. And that's kind of how DNA is. And it stores the information that makes proteins. So proteins are super important in biology. Proteins are all kinds of different things. There's structural proteins, there's hormones, enzymes, there's transport proteins, and so much of our body is, really our entire body is dependent on making proteins. Now we'll talk more about that in later units as well, but that's what DNA is. It stores the information that our cells use to make proteins. DNA is what's transferred between different generations during reproduction. So your DNA is a combination of your parents. My DNA is roughly 50% from my mom, 50% from my dad. Now, we'll talk all kinds of different stuff about DNA. That is also its own unit. But for now, let's just know that it's the genetic material that gets passed on from generation to generation. Now, ribosomes. This is the last of the 4 things that every cell has. So hopefully these are all familiar. Ribosomes, like we said before, are what assemble proteins. And so what happens specifically is that the code from the DNA is copied and that gets sent to the ribosomes where they start to assemble the proteins. They start linking amino acids together, which are what proteins are. Now, it says it's on the outside of the ER, which is what we're going to talk about here very soon, and they separate in the cell. But so we're not necessarily going to talk about RNA too much. There's RNA and DNA, but the long and short of this, the most specific thing I want you to know is that ribosomes assemble proteins. So those are the 4 things that all cells have. But there's a lot of other stuff too. And so we're going to keep on going. Now this list up here, you might notice on the notes, is not everything on here. These are just examples of things that other eukaryotic cells have. So we're going to go through a list that doesn't have everything, but it's got a lot of stuff that you can find in other eukaryotic cells. Remember, these are not prokaryotes, these are eukaryotic cells. So cell walls, they can occur in prokaryotes. We've talked about this already once, right? But in eukaryotes, they occur in plants. So you'll never see a cell wall in an animal cell. You'll see it in a plant cell. And so what it is it's outside of the cell membrane, and it gives extra protection for the cell, and it gives extra structure to the cell. So if you look at this picture here, there's this thin thing going around the cell, and that's the cell membrane. And then there's a much thicker and much more rigid wall around the cell, and that's the cell wall. And so it's only in plants and prokaryotes. And what this does is if you think about plants, for example, let's compare plants and animals. Animals have to move around a lot. They have to be flexible. We are constantly moving around. Plants are staying still. They move, but not necessarily as quickly as us But they spend most of their lives, just kind of, if not all of their lives, stuck in one spot. So they have to be really rigid, they have to be strong. They can't defend themselves, so they have to have a little extra protection around their cells. So that's the cell wall. We're going to keep on going, and here we have the cytoskeleton. So cyto is a prefix that means cell. So cytoplasm was the kind of the plasma of the cell. The cytoskeleton is the cell's skeleton. And so what it is it's made up of all these different things you might hear. There's the centrosome, microtubules, filaments. I'm not really worried about all those words for you right now, but basically it's a system of these different tubes and structures within the cell that are really small, and they provide shape and support for the cell. They help hold the organelles in place, they help move the organelles around if they need to, and they can help move the shape of the cell to help it move as well. So the cytoskeleton is a system of these small tubes and filaments that do all of those. They provide shape and support, they help move organelles and the cell. They also help in cell division, which I don't have up there, but these, when it comes time for the cell to divide, these are important for dividing the cell and kind of drawing everything off to the sides, pinching in the walls. Now let's go down to the nucleus. And the thing I want you to know about the nucleus is that it contains the DNA. So in prokaryotes, the DNA is just floating around inside the cell. In eukaryotes, remember the definition of a eukaryote is that it has a nucleus and organelles, with membrane-bound organelles, or organelles that are separate from the inside of the cell. So the nucleus is this big purple thing here in this picture, and it holds the instructions for making proteins. Now, we could be really specific if we wanted. There's technically something called the nucleolus or the nucleolus inside, which is almost like the inner core of the nucleus. There's nucleoplasm, which is similar to the cytoplasm, but it's in the nucleus. But I'm not so worried about you knowing that. What I want you to know is that the nucleus is where the DNA is stored. And that's the most important thing. Next, we have something called the endoplasmic reticulum. Now this is quite the name. We like to abbreviate this as the ER, because we don't want to say endoplasmic reticulum, endoplasmic reticulum. Right, you don't want to say that word a bunch of times. So we just say it the ER. And what it is it's this system of folded tubes that helps assemble and fold proteins or lipids, which are fats. So for us specifically, we're going to look at proteins right now. And it's these folded tubes. It's divided into two parts, the rough ER and the smooth ER. And so on the rough ER, it's called rough because there are ribosomes kind of scattered all around the surface. And so remember, ribosomes are where proteins are made, and so it makes sense that this is where this helps assemble and then fold those proteins, because proteins are not just a long strand of chemicals, they're all folded every which way, and that's really important. And if a protein is misfolded, that's a huge issue. And so the rough ER has ribosomes, the smooth ER does not. And that's the endoplasmic reticulum. It assembles and folds proteins. Now I want to keep on going. So there's only a few left. I know this is a pretty long list, but that's why I want to make this its own lecture, so you get the chance to kind of focus exclusively on this, right? If we're talking about this, we don't need to be talking about anything else today. So the next one is the Golgi apparatus, and it's a stacked layer of enclosed tubes. It's an interesting looking thing. And this is where proteins are packaged and labeled for delivery out of the cell. So I like to think of this as like an Amazon warehouse. And so if you think about what Amazon is, right? It's a website, a company, and you order something through Amazon. And then the warehouse is where they put it in the box, they label the box, and it's basically, they do everything there to ship it out. And so they are not actually the ones delivering it, but they are preparing it to be sent out everywhere. And if proteins are made in the cell, they're sent sometimes to the same cell, to other cells, to other parts of the body. And so here, this is where they're labeling and packaging all of that. And we'll talk about how they do that a little bit later. So the Golgi apparatus
sometimes called the Golgi body. It's where proteins are packaged and labeled. Now this one, if you've heard of any of these, the mitochondria is the one you may or may not have heard of, have likely heard of. And more than likely you've heard that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. For whatever reason, that seems to be the phrase or the tagline that everyone remembers from biology. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And that's true. What the mitochondria is its little kind of bean-shaped thing almost, and it uses food to make energy from the cell. And so if you're a plant, well, you're not a plant, but plants make their own food, and then their mitochondria turn that food into energy. We ingest our food, we eat it, and then our cells use that food to make energy. So they convert it to chemical energy that our body can use. And it's this bean-shaped thing that has inner and outer membranes. And if you remember from the last set of notes, the last lecture, we talked about the theory of endosymbiosis or symbiosis. And that's the theory for how eukaryotes came into existence. And what we believe is that specifically the mitochondria and the chloroplast, which we'll talk about soon, are that they were initially bacteria on their own. And that they were their own kind of small prokaryotic cell. And they were absorbed or engulfed by a larger cell. And so the reason it's significant that they have a double membrane is because we think this was the original membrane of the original prokaryote, and then this is the bubble that was formed around them when they were absorbed. Now, they have their own DNA, and they have their own ribosomes, which again leads us to believe that they started out as something else. So we believe that they used to be separate prokaryotic cells. But as far as function is concerned, the mitochondria is what makes the cells energy. Chloroplast, I said I would talk about these next. These are the other organelle that we think used to be a separate prokaryote, and they have an inner and outer membrane for the exact same reason. Now, these little guys are what make plants green. You can see here that this is green, and it's in plants only. This is where photosynthesis happens. So photosynthesis is the way that plants take sunlight and convert that into food. That food can then be used to make energy, and so plants literally make their own food. And so we have these things, these stacks that contain a pigment called chlorophyll that absorbs sunlight. And so chlorophyll is green, and that's actually what makes these green and what makes plants green. Again, we used to think that these were also separate cells, and specifically what happens in photosynthesis is that sunlight is converted and with a number of other things to make sugars. And that sugar is then sent to the mitochondria, where the mitochondria converts it into energy. And those are the chloroplast. Only a few more. Vesicles are next. And so if this looks familiar, that's because this is a picture of the Golgi apparatus, which we said was like the Amazon warehouse, right? Or the Amazon packaging center. And so what vesicles are these little bubbles around here. And so they're membrane-bound bubbles. And again, a membrane is just basically something to keep it separate from everything around it. And so our next unit is actually membranes and cell membranes, and we'll discuss a little bit further what those are. But so these are pretty short-lived things. They're not always there. They're made as they're needed, and then they go away. And they pinch off of the Golgi apparatus more often than not. And the way I'd like you to think of those is if the Golgi apparatus is the Amazon warehouse, and that's where they label and package them, the vesicles are the packages themselves, or the delivery trucks, however you want to think of it. And so they're sent out, and they're these little packages that deliver the proteins where they need to go. So vesicles are in charge of transporting proteins. Now, we're going to talk about the last two here in the last slide. Vacuoles and lysosomes. So vacuoles are similar to a vesicle, but they're a little bit bigger. And animals have small vacuoles, and plants have one big, large vacuole, and we call that the large central vacuole. So that's what this picture is here. This is a plant cell, and hopefully we can see the green chloroplasts in the cell wall, so you know it's a plant cell.
And then they also have this large central vacuole. And what those do is they contain water for the cell and they help it hold the shape. And so for us, the way we want to think of it is because plants and animals have them is they hold water, they store things. And so in plants, they have a big one because they really need water, right? We can drink water, we can just go get it. Plants can't. They have to stay in one spot and absorb all the water they can when they get it. And plants do that by storing it in the large central vacuole. Lysosomes are the last one we're going to talk about today, and we're only going to talk about them just very briefly. They look like vesicles, they're very similar, but they serve a different purpose, and that is to export waste. So that could be waste from processes. So if a cell is making something and has a waste product, lysosomes get rid of that. If something enters the cell that maybe shouldn't be there, lysosomes, among other things, help get that out. And so lysosomes get rid of waste, vacuoles store things, and most of the time, specifically water. And that's it for the list of organelles. Now, it's a lot of stuff. It's a little bit of stuff to remember. I don't need you to religiously memorize these, right? You don't need to spend every waking moment memorizing the function and the anatomy of all these things, but I do want you to be familiar with them and to know roughly what each of these do. There's one other section in the notes, and that's what we have pulled up here as well. Sorry, wrong thing. Plants and animal cells that have key differences. And so here we have a diagram of each, and we see this on the lecture slide or on the notes as well. And so there's some things we didn't talk about in here, like centrioles, and that's okay. But we have lysosomes in both plant and animal cells. We have cytoplasm, the Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria, cell membrane, nucleus, vacuoles. All of those things are in both plant and animal cells. But plant cells have three specific things that I want to talk about that are only in plant cells. The first of which is the chloroplasts. And remember that those are what create the chemical energy from the sun by doing photosynthesis. And so photosynthesis is the process of taking sunlight and converting it into energy, or into food that can become energy. The chloroplasts are what do that, and those are these things right here, or in this case, right here. They're the green things that look like they have little stacks of coins in them. The next thing that the plants have that animals don't, just a recap, hopefully you remember us talking about these not too long ago, it's the cell wall. If you look here, the plant cell is typically more rounded, right? It's enclosed by the membrane. Here, animal cells here, plant cells here. And these are a little bit more rigid. They look a little bit more like a hexagon, or sometimes they're kind of square, and they have a much more rigid structure. And that's because of the cell wall. That gives them more structure and helps protect the cell. And the way it describes it here is that it maintains a rigid shape of the cell for a stiffer structure. And plants need to have a stiff structure because they need to stand tall. Think about a tree. Think about how tall that stands, how hard that is, right? Plant cells. Lastly, we have the large central vacuole. So we have small vacuoles here in the plants or in the animal cells, and those store things. They store water, sure. But here in the plant cell, we have the big, large central vacuole, and that's the third thing. And those store water and nutrients so that the plant has a constant supply of water, which it needs for photosynthesis. A plant cannot make food for itself without water, and so water is necessary for survival, and so they need to have a big storage supply of it all the time. And so those are our three: the chloroplast, cell wall, and large central vacuoles. And so that now is all I wanted to talk about for organelles. And so hopefully you got all of this. The drawings are not necessary, but you have room for them if you want it, if that helps you remember. And so thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.